Hey everybody, welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games. Today we have another top 10 list for you all. Today I'm going to be sharing with you guys my top 10 board games designed by Uwe Rosenberg. Now Uwe Rosenberg is yet another of my favorite board game designers. He is yet another prolific board game designer who has been doing it for a very long time, over 25 years at this point. Now, speaking of 25, I've played 25 of Uwe Rosenberg's titles over the course of my illustrious board game career, and yet there's still so many other unplayed titles. So if you don't see it on this list, there's a decent chance that perhaps I haven't gotten to it yet. But 25 is a pretty good sample size, so without any further ado, let's get straight to the list. So actually, before getting to the list, I do have one honorable mention. I figured that with 25 games, at least one extra game deserved making it onto this list, because I theoretically or ideally would have liked for this game to make it to the list, but it just missed the cut. My number 11 Uwe Rosenberg game of all time is Glass Road. And Glass Road here, it's such a brilliant design. It's a game that packs perhaps the heaviest time to weight ratio of any Uwe Rosenberg game. Most of Uwe Rosenberg's heavier games tend to last an hour, 90 minutes, maybe even up to 2 hours plus. But Glass Road here plays in about 40 minutes. And this game here, basically players are trying to produce resources and transfer them or convert them into other resources, ultimately with a goal of building buildings. Two of the more primary resources in this game are your glass and your brick. And it's very interesting because Uwe Rosenberg in this game, he does something that he's done in many of his games, but a little bit different here, where you have this wheel here to manage and keep track of two different sets of resources. And you have a bunch of basic resources on one side of the wheel, and on the other side of the wheel, you have your special resource. So up here, this top part here is for your glass, and this top part here is for your brick. And as you progress through the game and you increase your values in each of these different resources, whenever these two brown numbers, the sectors that correspond with those two brown sections, whenever they're both empty, you're going to rotate the wheel one space to the right or clockwise, and this will simulate the idea that these resources are being converted into either brick or glass. So managing this wheel is the key to having a lot of those resources. And those resources are very crucial because some of the more valuable buildings that you'll be able to build on your little plot of land represented by your own player board, a lot of these buildings require either glass or brick. My number 11 Uwe Rosenberg game of all time, Glass Road. And now we move on to my number 10. My number 10 board game designed by Uwe Rosenberg is Cave versus Cave, or Caverna Cave versus Cave. And this is the two-player iteration of Caverna, the very popular worker placement game. And quite often, Uwe Rosenberg takes these bigger, successful titles of his, and he converts them into a smaller two-player only production, which comes in a smaller package and also is finely tuned to a two-player game. And this basically simulates the same ideas of dwarves who are furnishing their caverns within their cave. They're excavating to make space for different rooms, and they are acquiring different rooms that will produce different actions, ultimately to make them much more efficient. But instead of worker placement, you have this row of different action tiles, and you have an idea as to when these action tiles are going to be revealed, but you're not necessarily going to know exactly when. So you have a bunch of your level 2 actions here, your level 3 and your level 4, and they're randomly shuffled and revealed as the game progresses. And the game goes through a course of 8 rounds, and starting off in the game, you're only going to get 2 actions per turn, but then as the game revs up, you're going to get 3 and you're going to get 4, and they're all represented by these different action tiles. And you're going to be able to trigger action tiles that are going to give you different amount of resources and different types of actions. They're going to allow you to build or to excavate in your cave system and to add buildings that ultimately are going to give you victory points. Instead of having actual tangible resources, players are just going to have one simple token that they're going to represent how much they have of said resource by raising it here on this track and managing that. There is a maximum, a cap. You can never have more than a certain amount of each of these resources. So that's something to keep in mind. I believe gold is the only resource that you can have double of this amount. So that is something to keep in mind. But one of the reasons why this game actually ranks pretty well on my list, a little spoiler, Agricola, All Creatures, Big and Small, did not make it to my top 10 Uwe Rosenberg games, even though I really do like that game. However, I find that Agricola, All Creatures, Big and Small is so much like Agricola. It's just a abbreviated, truncated, shorter, condensed version of Agricola. Well, I find that Caverna is different enough, Cave versus Cave is different enough from Caverna because it's not worker placement. Instead, you have a slightly different mechanism taking place. My number 10 Uwe Rosenberg game of all time, Cave versus Cave. Now we move on to my number 9. And speaking of Caverna, we've got it right here. This is my number 9 board game of all time. I do like it better than Cave versus Cave. However, I do not like it more than the other 8 games that are coming ahead of it. And this is, if not the most popular game on BoardGameGeek.com, I'm pretty sure it's at least the second most popular. This game is very well received, at least in that BGG community. And this game here is a heavy worker placement agricultural game, very akin to lots of Uwe Rosenberg's designs. Thematically speaking, he really gravitates to this rural agricultural setting. But in this case, it's a little bit of a fantasy element as well, because you've got the dwarves, just like in Cave versus Cave, and that's your family. That's your group of people. You got your mama dwarf and your papa dwarf, and you're growing your family. And not only are you doing the farm life and planting crops and breeding and animals, doing some animal husbandry, but you're also developing your system of caverns, which will be furnished and will create different types of rooms. First of all, rooms for your family members to abide in order to be able to continue to grow your family. Also, different types of furnishments, different types of buildings or rooms that are going to allow you different abilities. They're going to allow you to gain resources in different ways and what have you. And again, this is a worker placement game where little by little each round you have one additional action that's being revealed. So as the game progresses, you have more options as to what you can do. One of the neat things that you can do in this game that you can't in many of Uwe Rosenberg's agricultural worker placement games is that you can send your dwarves on expeditions, and basically as you send them on expeditions, they level up and they become stronger and stronger, and therefore can bring back better loot when they go on these different expeditions. So that's something to keep in mind. But this game, very beautiful chunky pieces to represent the meeples, to represent the animals, to represent the different resources that you produce, just like in lots of Uwe Rosenberg's games. But for whatever reason, it's still only number 9 on my list at the time being, Caverna. Now we move on to my number 8 Uwe Rosenberg game, and that is Patchwork. And Patchwork is the popular polyomino tile laying game where players are trying to complete their quilt here, represented by this grid, this square grid here, and they're placing these polyomino Tetris-like shaped pieces one by one, trying to occupy as many spaces as possible, because each empty space is going to actually subtract from your score at the end of the game. And the cool thing about this game is that you have a little button economy. These different tiles have a different amount of buttons printed on them, and whenever you pass the time track at certain intervals, you're going to collect your economy. You're going to collect your salary of buttons according to the amount of buttons on the tiles that are on your quilt at the time being. And it's really cool because you're managing this really tight system of action selection where you only have the next 3 tiles, the next 3 polyomino shaped tiles available to you at a given time. So you can't just jump around to any tile that you want on the lineup. But those 3, that gives you a little bit of an option because they all have varying costs as far as the buttons that you must spend in order to gain them, but also the amount of time, because as you advance and progress in the time track, you are going to have fewer and fewer turns. And not only that, it's a 2-player only game, and the player who's further behind on that time track is always going to be the current player. So that's something to think about. Do you want to advance too far ahead on that time track and give your opponent several turns in a row to kind of pick up the scraps? Something to truly consider. Really cool, really neat the way it's executed. My number 8 Uwe Rosenberg game, Patchwork. And now we move on to my number 7. And my number 7 Uwe Rosenberg game is At the Gates of Loyang. Another rural kind of agricultural themed game, except instead of a European medieval setting, we have a Chinese setting here instead. And this game is not worker placement at all. Instead, players are taking different actions. They are planting this game, as I mentioned, agricultural, and they're planting all of these different veggies on their fields, on their farm fields. And little by little, they are harvesting these veggies, and they're going to sell them to different customers. And there's two types of customers in this game. You've got your regular customers who are going to consistently come back to you, trying to find the same exact pair of resources or veggies that you will deliver to them. And then you've got your casual customers who are only going to come shopping one time, and they're typically going to be asking for 3 different veggies. And there's something to consider, because your casual customers, they're going to pay you a little bit more than your regular customers. But your regular customers, if you keep them happy, they're going to keep on coming back to you and giving you that guaranteed money 4 times successively. The challenge of the regular customers, and why you perhaps don't want to have too many of them at a given time, is that if you ever fail to fulfill a regular customer's demand, you're going to flip over this token that's going to indicate that they're unsatisfied. If a regular customer is unsatisfied 2 turns in a row, then you are going to pay a 2 coin penalty. And coins are very, very valuable, because you're going to use coins to go up and travel on this prosperity track, which ultimately will be your score at the end of the game. I find this to be one of Uwe Rosenberg's better games to play solo. I love the aesthetic of the Veggie Meeples. My number 7 Uwe Rosenberg game at the Gates of Loyang. And now we move on to my number 6 Uwe Rosenberg game, and that is Le Havre Inland Port, another 2-player only iteration of a very popular Uwe Rosenberg game, namely Le Havre. And as I mentioned with Cave versus Cave, and as opposed to Agricola, All Creatures Big and Small, Le Havre Inland Port takes the general concept of Le Havre and makes it a radically different game, even more so than Cave versus Cave. Yes, you have the same idea of running a port, running a harbor, and all this resource conversion in order to purchase buildings and ultimately make money, which are your victory points. But the way you go about it is very much different. In this game, first of all, players have this wheel here. Each individual player has this wheel that not only indicates and keeps track of the rounds, but it also keeps track of the different buildings that players are acquiring throughout the course of the game. And the buildings, instead of being represented by cards, are represented by these house-shaped tiles that when you first purchase, you're going to put it in the 0 sector of your little board here, your little wheel. And as the game progresses and you go through rounds, they're going to increase how many actions, how many times you can trigger that building when you decide to trigger. And ultimately, the most you can wait to is 4. If you wait too much beyond that, then you will lose this building and you'll only collect half of its value in gold. So you're going to lose a big investment from that. So timing as to when you execute these actions to get the biggest bang for your buck is the key to this game. Also, as you're gaining resources, instead of getting tokens that represent your resources, you're going to have 1 token that you're going to move along this track. And it's very interesting because the way you manipulate it, lots of the buildings, what the actions they trigger, are allowing you to move either right or diagonally upward or downward across this track. And it's really interesting to manipulate this, because once you make it to the end of a particular row, it's not a simple matter of just going up to the next column when you increase in that resource. You've got to find a way up or a way diagonally upwards in order to actually increase in that value. So I find that the puzzle of manipulating this little grid here is very fascinating and very interesting. At the same time, it still gives me a lot of that Le Havre feel as I play this game. My number 6 Uwe Rosenberg game of all time, Le Havre Inland Port. And now we move on to the top 5, the cream of the crop, my 5 absolute favorite Uwe Rosenberg designs, starting with my number 5, which is Ora Labora. And Ora Labora, yet another medieval, rural setting, worker placement game, resource management, resource conversion from Uwe Rosenberg. But this game has a lot of neat things going on it. And if it weren't for the fact that this game is probably, I'm pretty certain, the longest game on all of my top 10. As a matter of fact, I think this is the longest game of all the Uwe Rosenberg games that I personally own. If it weren't for the fact that this game is so long and so complex, it actually probably would have a better chance of ranking higher. But I do have to kind of disqualify it for a little bit because of that, because it is a little bit of a chore to actually get this game to the table. But it's such a brilliant design. I love this little wheel here, which you basically use to keep track of the different resources. And as the game progresses, as resources go unused, they will eventually increase in value when you choose to produce them. You still have to produce these resources. You still have to take and trigger the actions on the board that allow you to produce them, but you're going to produce them in the amounts and in the values equal to what is represented or indicated here on this wheel. So sometimes you got to know when to pull the trigger, because if you wait too long, it's going to get valuable and maybe your opponent will beat you to the punch. Get that much resources or produce that much of that resource, lower it back to 0, and now all of a sudden you're on the outside looking in. And there are so many resources in this game, and I keep them in these nice little trays here. And these resources, just like in Le Havre, they're represented by tiles that are double-sided because they show you a basic version of the resource and a upgraded version as well. So that's something to keep in mind. So you simply flip these tokens over every time you are upgrading them. And this game here is worker placement. As I mentioned, players start with a basic board here representing their farmlands and their cloister office. This is a game simulating medieval monastic life, and each player starts with 3 workers. And basically, your workers are your monks. One worker is your prior. He's a special worker because he allows you to trigger a building's action even on the same round that that building was played. Because normally, when a building is first added to your board here, you're not going to have that building's action available to you until a future round, unless you have your prior available. And your prior is not always going to be available because as you place workers down, you actually do not remove your workers at the end of each round, as your typical Uwe Rosenberg games allows you to do. Instead, until all 3 of your workers are on your board, you do not get to retrieve them. So that's something to think about and map out, especially as you decide which worker you're going to use and when you're going to use your prior. Lots of stuff going on. You're expanding your board with these additional tiles to create more land space in order to create more space for those buildings. And not only are those buildings going to be your worker placement spots that trigger different actions, in particular your production of resources, your conversion of said resources, but also those buildings are going to score you victory points at the end of the game. And the way they score you victory points is very intricate because there's a spatial element to it. Buildings are going to score points according to what other buildings are around them. And not every building can be placed on any particular terrain type on your board. So there's so many of these spatial elements taking place as you decide to build a building. You got to factor that all in. Is there a legal location for me to place it on? And how many points will this get me depending on where I place it on my board? Really cool, really neat, brilliant game. My number 5, Uwe Rosenberg, Ora Labora. Now we move on to my number 4, and my number 4 is Merkator. And Merkator here is probably the unsung hero of my list. This is the most underrated game. I believe it's the only game of all of these games on my top 10 that is not ranked in the top 1,000. I believe it's actually pretty far from the top 1,000, perhaps in the 12 or 1,300 mark. And this game here, first of all, it's an ugly board game. It does not look good. The cover doesn't really look good. And the board looks even worse because the board, it's basically just an abstracted map of Renaissance Europe, and basically players are navigating that map by moving this little piece here that represents your Merkator, your merchant. And this is not even a meeple, right? So compared to all of Uwe Rosenberg's other games, aesthetically, it's not that pleasing. And then you got your resources here, which are just basically colored cubes. Instead of all these different veggie meeples that all of Uwe Rosenberg's games here, you simply have cubes. And to top it all off, not only do you have cubes, but each of these colored cubes represents 2 different resources in the game. So they couldn't even come with different cubes for different resources. And basically the way you keep track of it is each player has their little warehouse board here. And based on where you place it when you acquire that colored cube, that will determine which type of resource it represents. So now that I've said all the terrible things about this game, how is it that it ranks number 4 so high on my list? And it's because I love what's taking place, and it is the contract for fulfillment. Players are basically trying to fulfill these different contracts of differing levels, increasing in ascending order of value. And as you fulfill these contracts by moving the Merkator piece to a particular country, a particular region in Europe, then you'll be able to deliver the goods. It's a pickup and delivery game in essence. You're picking up resources from one country and eventually delivering them to another. And as you do that, you're going to fulfill these contracts, and every time you fulfill a contract, you will be granted a new contract of the next level. And ultimately, you're trying to progress all the way to level 14 and see if at the end of the game, you're the player with the most points. But the cool thing about this game is that every time you move this Merkator piece into a new land, you're going to trigger the economy, not only of that land, but of all of its surrounding nations, all the nations that are linked to it by a route depicted on the board. So that I find to be a really cool and neat thematic thing there. Also, this game includes an element of time where there is a resource referred to as time, and when players want to travel to particular locations, they need to spend these time tokens in order to do so. When they travel to other locations, it saves them time and they gain time as a resource. Also, if a player wants to piggyback on another player's turn when they're going to a particular region, they need to spend time tokens. They need to pay time tokens to that player in order to take an action on their turn as well. Really cool, really neat, lots of cool things going on. If this game was better looking, there's a chance it might rank higher. But for now, number 4 is still pretty good. Number 4, Uwe Rosenberg game, Merkator. Now we move on to my number 3. And my number 3, for a very long time, was actually my favorite Uwe Rosenberg game. But now, the mighty have fallen. And that is Agricola, the classic, original rural agricultural worker placement Uwe Rosenberg game. And in this game, basically, you are growing your family from a mama and a daddy, and you're trying to grow up to 5 family members potentially. You're trying to expand your house to accommodate those family members. You're trying to get food in order to feed your people, feed your family. And this game here, you're doing all the typical tropes of the Uwe Rosenberg agricultural games. You're planting crops, harvesting them. You're participating in animal husbandry and breeding different animals. You got cattle and pigs and sheep. The Farmers of the Moor expansion adds horses as an additional animal, and as long as you have pairs on your board, you'll be able to breed at the end of each round. But sometimes you're gonna have to convert them into food in order to feed your family. However, if you do not have major improvements such as different ovens and such, you're not going to be able to produce or convert that animal into food, and therefore you won't be able to feed your family. Very strict, restrictive game. You have so many different areas that you're trying to do a little bit in, or else you're going to have points deducted from your score at the end of the game. And that's one of the things that lots of people do not like about this game, but it's actually something that I appreciate. I appreciate how stingy this game can be. Also, I love the process of drafting your minor improvements and your occupation cards at the beginning of each game. And there's tons of cards that come in this game, in the base game alone, all the other expansions and the card packs that they've provided throughout the course of the years add additional options. But as you're choosing those cards, you're basically mapping out your strategy for the game and hoping to carry it out to fruition. It's actually the planning game par excellence as far as I'm concerned, because you actually strategize your game before the game actually starts. And yes, as the game unfolds, you're going to have to adapt and deviate and tactically react to what's before you right then and right there. But that process of trying to map out your game and actually successfully doing it so to some extent is a very fulfilling feeling. My number 3 Uwe Rosenberg game, Agricola. And now we move on to my number 2. And my number 2 is Le Havre. Le Havre, as I mentioned with Le Havre in the port, here you are at a harbor. You're producing different resources, converting different resources, trying to ship those different resources, and build different buildings in order to get as many victory points as possible. There is a common area of buildings that are available to all players, and each player throughout the course of the game is building buildings in their section of Le Havre. And another player can use your buildings for its worker placement action. However, they're going to have to pay you money or food in order to do so. This game also involves the feeding of your people, but it's a little bit more forgiving, a little bit more manageable than Agricola. However, you do need to keep on top of it, because if you do not have food to feed your people, instead you're going to have to spend money, which ultimately those are your victory points. This game does have a loan system where you can borrow money by taking a loan, and if you're able to pay it off during the course of the game, you're fine. If not, at the end of the game, there will be a bit of a penalty for doing so, so that's something to keep in mind. Very generous game. The resource conversion in this game is such a fun experience. I love the fact that each round is divided into an odd number of actions. You have 7 actions distributed among all the players. So whether you're playing 2 or 4 or whatever the player count, you're always going to have 7 actions divided, which means each round there's going to be 1 or more players that get an extra action than all the other players. So mapping out your decisions, knowing which round it is and which round you're going to get that 1 extra action on is very crucial. My number 2 Uwe Rosenberg game of all time, Le Havre. And now finally we move on to my number 1 Uwe Rosenberg game. And this game is actually relatively new to my list. But so far, the few times I've played it, it has had a strong impression. And that is Fields of Arle, yet another Uwe Rosenberg rural agricultural worker placement game. However, this one here is 2-player only if you get the tea and trade expansion, which I do not have as of yet. That does open the game up for 3 players. However, the base game is a 2-player only game. And basically, the game is divided into 9 rounds. You have 5 summer rounds and 4 winter rounds. And basically, the board is divided into 2 sections of worker placement actions. And one section is not available to you during the opposite round. So for example, if you are in a winter round, you do not have the summer actions available to you. If you are in a summer round, you do not have the winter actions available to you. So right here you have your summer actions here and your winter actions here. And that's something to keep in mind. Now, you do have exactly 1 action on a round that you can take on the opposite season. So for example, in the summer round, you can take 1 winter action. However, the first player to do so blocks that action from the other player. So only 1 player each round can take an out-of-season action. So that's something to keep in mind. And at the end of each round, you have your typical upkeep that takes place in Uwe Rosenberg games, where you're going to have to manage food, perhaps the breeding of some animals. However, the upkeep in one season is different than the other. One season you might have to produce peat in order to keep warm, to provide fuel and keep your house warm for the winter season. In another round, you might produce wool or you might produce food depending on the amount of animals you have in your farm. And there's so many things that are taking place as you are trying to progress in this game. Lots of really cool, neat things going on. You're trying to use your vehicles in order to convert your resources into upgraded versions of themselves. You're using your resources, or your vehicles, I should say, to travel to different parts of the land that require specific resources. And as you do, you progress in your travel track, which will give you additional victory points at the end of the game. Lots of things going on. I still have so much more exploring to do in this game, but so far, it has had such an impression on me that it has skyrocketed above all these other titles as my favorite Uwe Rosenberg game for the time being. Fields of Arle. And that's it for today's list, folks. Thank you so much for joining us here when Havre Board Games. Please comment down below and tell me what's your favorite Uwe Rosenberg game of all time. Tell me what you think about my particular list of 10. And thank you so much for joining us here. I'll catch you guys next time. This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.